Hi, I'm Davy Knittle. This is a paper for the Humanities on the Brink conference. The title of my paper is The Climate of AIDS, Gentrification, Urgency, and Loss at the End of Nature. On October 13, 1996, an estimated 300 protesters gathered before the gates of the White House to throw urns, boxes, and bags containing the ashes of AIDS victims over the fence and onto the White House lawn. The demonstration, a mass political funeral for people killed by AIDS in the deadliest years of the pandemic in the US, was organized by the advocacy group ACT UP. The action was inspired by a passage in David Wojnarowicz's 1991 essay collection, Close to the Knives, a Memoir of Disintegration, in which Wojnarowicz speculates about regular public action in response to AIDS. He writes, "I imagine what it would be like if each time a lover, friend, or stranger died of this disease, their friends, lovers, or neighbors would take the dead body and drive with it in a car 100 miles an hour to Washington, D.C., and blast through the gates of the White House and come to a screeching halt before the entrance and dump their lifeless form on the front steps." Wojnarowicz died of AIDS in July 1992, less than a year after the publication of Close to the Knives. The banner that led his own political funeral through the streets of Manhattan's Lower East Side read, "David Wojnarowicz, 1954 to 1992, died of AIDS due to government neglect." In his discussion of the grief of early AIDS mourners, Dagmawi Woubshet argues, the formal and political character of their grief confounds and traverses the limits of mourning. Woubshet posits further, the unique formal and extraformal dimensions of this body of mourning have significant implications for the way we theorize loss. As Woubshet himself notes, the form used by early AIDS mourners to contain their grief, the form of the political funeral, of the street protest, of the public art action, was in dialogue with the downtown art scene in the New York City of the 1980s and early 1990s, in which Wojnarowicz was active, and where the largest number of AIDS cases in the US were concentrated. Contemporaneous and complexly entangled with the early years of AIDS in New York was the gentrification of many areas of the city, including the Lower East Side, where Wojnarowicz lived. The gentrification of US cities in the 1980s is situated in what Neil Smith identifies as the urban manifestation of the neoliberal policies of globalized racial capitalism. As Smith explains, gentrification was facilitated by global economic expansion in the 1980s, the restructuring of national and urban economies in advanced capitalist countries towards services, recreation, and consumption, and the emergence of a global hierarchy of world, national, and regional cities. As geographer Caitlin Cahill argues the gentrification of the Lower East Side, in language that mirrors the public cultures of loss described by Woubshet, gentrification is experienced as a loss of self, community, and culture. Furthermore, as Sarah Schulman argues, in the Lower East Side, the early years of the AIDS pandemic further sped the pace of gentrification. Schulman explains that the high rate of deaths from AIDS was one of a number of determining factors in the rapid gentrification of key neighborhoods of Manhattan, because as people died of AIDS, surviving partners or roommates were not allowed to inherit leases that had been in the dead person's name. The simultaneous processes of gentrification and the concentration of AIDS deaths in US cities in the late 1980s and early 1990s created an interlocking web of loss for people with AIDS. Many simultaneously negotiated the loss of their homes and the loss of their lives. This interlocking network of dispossession contributed to public narratives of loss, for which spatial displacement and mass death due to AIDS were inextricable illustrations of the disenfranchisement of marginalized people under the racial capitalist policies of neoliberal globalization. As Jody Melamed argues, racialization naturalizes the privileges of those who benefit from present socioeconomic arrangements and makes the dispossession of those cut off from wealth and institutional power appear fair. In the early years of the AIDS pandemic, racialized experiences of dispossession caused by neoliberal globalization linked AIDS to gentrification and also to early public conversations about climate change. In his writing and art practice, Wojnarowicz looked to the behavior of non-human animals, the weather, the Hudson River, and the land on which New York was built for coalitional bonds that gathered human and non-human actors dispossessed by neoliberal globalization. As I expand upon below, he simultaneously imagined climate disaster as a venue for creative destruction and objected to an enduring imaginary of nature that bolstered and justified the misuse of ecological resources and the dispossession of marginalized people. In the essay, Do Not Doubt the Dangerousness of the 12-Inch Politician, Wojnarowicz asks, why is it any other person but myself can make a determination that affects the health or safety of my body? Why are so many silent in the face of this? Is it because the sky is blue that most people feel safe from this disease called AIDS? Wojnarowicz questions linked perceptions of the planet to logics that justify the under-resourcing of marginalized people. As Bill McKibben describes in his contemporaneous early work on climate change, The End of Nature, published in 1989, a book Wojnarowicz owned at the time of his death, the ability to take comfort in the blueness of the sky is a denial not only of how normative ideology and behavior imperil the lives of marginalized people, but also of human geological impact. Reflecting on the statistic that in the late 1980s, the average car driven the average U.S. distance of 10,000 miles per year emits its weight in carbon into the atmosphere annually, McKibben argues, imagine each car on a busy freeway pumping a ton of carbon into the atmosphere, and the sky seems infinitely less blue. What McKibben refers to as a problematic sense of nature as eternal and separate is entangled with the public narratives that, Wojnarowicz argues, allowed a late 1980s public to feel that a disease killing more than 30,000 people a year in the U.S. was as distant from them as a version of nature untouched by human activity. Nature, as a conceptual category in the U.S. in the late 1980s, was linked to human sexuality generally and to the AIDS pandemic in particular. Conservative politician Pat Buchanan argued in 1983 that the poor homosexuals, they have declared war upon nature, and now nature is extracting an awful retribution, AIDS. In 1987, biologist Stephen Jay Gould used the AIDS pandemic to argue against a teleological equation of technological development with empirical societal gain. He writes, the AIDS pandemic provides a more striking proof that mind and technology are not omnipotent and that we have not canceled our bond to nature. Seeking to depathologize the pandemic, Gould goes on to refer to the biology of AIDS as an ordinary natural phenomenon, and to state explicitly that AIDS is natural, it's part of nature, so are we. Even as he acknowledges that the failure to mobilize governmental resources in response to the pandemic is entirely bound up with stigma against IV drug users, queer people, and people of color. The treatment of AIDS was further bound up with non-human life, as one focus of AIDS research was the U.S. government's pledge of $4.5 million in 1986 to launch a chimpanzee breeding program in order to infect the animals with simian HIV, SIV, in response to research by primatologists that use non-human primates to develop a vaccine for human AIDS patients. As Wojnarowicz demonstrates, intervening at the intersection of nature and culture in the early years of the AIDS pandemic in the U.S. required an engagement with how globalization was reshaping the cities where the pandemic was concentrated, but also with the circulation of racialized ideas of sex, gender, and kinship as they were understood and justified as natural or unnatural, and the implication of this use of nature for understanding climate change. Addressing neoliberal policy as a producer of interspecies harm helped Wojnarowicz at once to conceptualize death and to refuse to be subsumed within a necropolitical reading of AIDS, as he attempted to understand how mass extinction and quotidian life might coexist. His work demonstrates that read together, the recent history of U.S. gentrification, the concentration of AIDS deaths in the early years of the pandemic, and contemporaneous work on climate change offer one framework for understanding systems of dispossession and forms of mass loss perpetuated by globalized racial capitalism. The late 2010s saw a resurgence in formal interest in the work of David Wojnarowicz. The UK-based Peninsula Press republished his short story collection, The Waterfront Journals, in 2018. That fall, the Whitney Museum of American Art mounted a major retrospective of Wojnarowicz's visual work. The show, David Wojnarowicz, History Keeps Me Awake at Night, was housed at the museum's new site at 99 Gansevoort Street, less than a block from the former site of the piers and abandoned warehouses that were an important cruising and social space for queer and trans people in the New York of the 1970s and 1980s, in which Wojnarowicz substantially documented. The exhibition announcement for the 2018 Whitney Museum retrospective describes the import of his contribution to U.S. counterculture and identifies his archive as composed of work that, quote, documents and illuminates a desperate period of American history, that of the AIDS crisis and culture wars of the late 1980s and early 1990s. But even the cover image of the exhibition illustrates what is absent from the curatorial introduction to his work and its framing as invested solely in U.S. queer and countercultural life. For Wojnarowicz, the forms of racialized privilege and entitlement that facilitated the massive and tremendously fatal under-resourcing of AIDS research and treatment, and the gentrification of Lower Manhattan, were intimately tied to dominant ideas and representations of both globalization and non-human life. The cover image for the exhibition is a photograph of Wojnarowicz taken by the artist Tom Warren, which Wojnarowicz subsequently annotated, the 1983-84 self-portrait of David Wojnarowicz. In the image, a collaged and painted photograph of Wojnarowicz is cropped in a straight line at the waist. The photograph depicts Wojnarowicz, dressed in a short-sleeve button-front shirt. His arms are crossed. He gazes just over the left shoulder of the viewer. Fragments of an Anglophone map of the globe have been excised from a spherical projection and reassembled to cover the right half of his face and neck. The eastern seaboard of the United States, with New York written larger than other place names, is a green landmass that meets his left hairline, sharing an edge with the pink landmass of Western Australia's Great Sandy Desert. The eastern coast of Australia covers his throat. At its pink western edge, it becomes the green of Azerbaijan. Argentina covers the flesh above his collarbone. More of Western Australia expands in the recess to the right of his lower lip and covers half of his mouth. Paraguay and the eastern half of Bolivia frame his chin. A central slice of Brazil reaches up the left side of his chin to the edge of his lip. 9 time zones illustrate his right forearm. His right hand holds a cigarette, lit and mostly smoked. A figure engulfed in flames runs away from his upper right arm. The left side of Wojnarowicz's own body is in flames. His right bicep bears a tattoo of the globe that centers the Americas, with partial outlines of Asia, Africa, Antarctica, and Europe visible at its edges. The image of the planet on Wojnarowicz's bicep is unlike the image of Earth with blue oceans, green land masses, and wisps of atmospheric clouds, canonical to illustrations of Earth Day, from the 1970s to the present, and emblematic of what Finis Dunaway refers to as a call to environmental citizenship. The land on Wojnarowicz's tattoo is the same blood red of the flames, the color of a sky in crisis, for instance, during the violent and destructive bushfires in Australia in the second half of 2019 and early 2020. In this image, there is no visible atmosphere. In fragmenting the planet across the surface of his face and neck, Wojnarowicz participates in what geographer Caitlin Cahill refers to as a feminist geopolitical project of bridging the interdependent scales of the global and the body to repopulate globalization and gentrification discourses, to demonstrate how our subjectivities are inextricably connected with processes of global urban restructuring. In the image, the scales of the global and the body coexist on the surface of Wojnarowicz's skin. The fragmentation of the globe, as it appears across Wojnarowicz's face, draws attention to the proximity of spatially distant places brought into dialogue by systems of racialized power. As Jody Melamed argues of the racialization of a world system, the emergence of a global order through a world-embracing system of capitalism, nation-states, colonies, and imperial rule was able to constitute itself as a global social structure only to the extent that it was racialized. In Wojnarowicz's self-portrait, New York and Brazil both touch Australia. Landmasses and oceans are excised from the map, which is recognizable as a representation of the globe, even as most of what constitutes the globe does not appear. The self-portrait emphasizes that the global order that Melamed describes is a process of physical remaking, both through the assignation of national boundaries as a result of colonial projects and their aftermath, and through a global system of capitalism that continuously redistributes people and social, economic, and ecological resources. The map on Wojnarowicz's face turns him into a surface on which global restructuring occurs. The self-portrait suggests that Wojnarowicz's experience as a white gay man living in poverty in the U.S., and eventually living as a person with AIDS, is complexly implicated in the forms of racialization that perpetuate neoliberal globalization. As a white cis male person who lives in the most populous city in the U.S., he is implicated in systems of power that at once figure him as a racialized subject and supplement the privilege of his whiteness. In 2009, South African public health scholar and longtime AIDS advocate Mary Crew published an article entitled HIV, AIDS, and Climate Change, A Pattern of Response in the UN Chronicle. In the short article, she argues that HIV/AIDS and climate change follow similar patterns of impact, as they instantiate a common foundation of state-sanctioned inequity. As she argues, just as HIV/AIDS exacerbates poverty, gender vulnerability, exploitation of children, and access to healthcare, so too may climate change heighten social dislocations. The AIDS pandemic, as she reminds us, grows from and contributes to poverty, hunger, exploitation, migration, lack of education, and a failure of political will and imagination. Crew takes the AIDS pandemic as both a present concern and a litmus test for the behavior of global social upheaval. The AIDS pandemic is at once infuriating to Crew as a failure of human rights and interesting to her as a map of how particular global phenomena interact with existing architectures of inequality. The early years of the AIDS pandemic produce at once a sociopolitical blueprint of how poverty, neoliberal global capital, urban redevelopment, racial capitalism, and inequitable environmental policy shape the uneven effects of global political crisis, and offer an affective map of the relationship between global understandings of and action in response to climate change and public grammars of loss. Climate change puts the entire human population in the position of reckoning characteristic of the early years of the AIDS pandemic. As Woubshet argues of Black queer poet Melvin Dixon in the poem, "These are just a few," he mourns not only past deaths, but also impending ones, including his own. Responses to climate change call us to revisit, on a global scale, Douglas Crimp's argument of early AIDS activism, in which mourning becomes militancy. Early responses to the AIDS pandemic by a global network of activists demonstrate how waves of mourning become action that targets both the product and the root of the devaluation of marginalized people. Early responses to AIDS reverse a pedagogy of loss, a means of learning to negotiate a climate of serial and repetitive losses. The particular pedagogy of loss characteristic of the early years of AIDS focuses on a relation between the material life of AIDS and the cultural imagination that AIDS activism counters and exposes. Wojnarowicz's proposed throwing of the corpses of the AIDS dead onto the White House lawn, and the actual AIDS ash actions of 1986, is a gesture in which the particular bodies thrown on the lawn are both evidence and metonym. The act of the political funeral, and particularly of bringing the physical remains of AIDS victims into contact with the architectures of U.S. democracy, identifies the co-constitution of the material effects of dispossession and the political imaginaries that produce it. It is this same meeting of materiality and its sociopolitical imaginaries that is relevant to the process of understanding and negotiating climate change. Relating the pedagogies of loss offered by early AIDS activists to contemporary understandings of climate change revisits a long-standing conversation across queer studies, eco-criticism, and critical race studies that considers both coalitional orientations and actual histories of advocacy across experiences of marginalization. Climate change simultaneously expands the possible coalition of people at risk for dispossession and raises new questions about the equation of social progress with rights claims. The echo and public narratives of climate change, of the rhetorics of loss of the AIDS pandemic, offers the example of a queer and trans rights agenda as a cautionary tale of conflating progress with state recognition. As trans studies scholar Dean Spade argues of the limits of a rights logic for resisting the dispossession of trans people, law reform tactics can have a role in mobilization-focused strategies, but law reform must never constitute the sole demand of trans politics. Spade encourages us, instead, to think in terms of populations and the allocation of resources and life chances. The question most relevant to eco-critics is how the interaction of climate change and a world system characterized by legacies of dispossession will, in Spade's words, quote, promote and maximize certain forms of life in ways of being. The early years of the AIDS pandemic provide a model for conceptualizing a resurgent and cyclical culture of loss, also characteristic of climate change, that offers a model for how we might build upon the urgency of environmental precarity to intensify our advocacy for justice beyond the purview of rights claims, to mourn without being subsumed by a necropolitical imaginary, to face, as Wojnarowicz did, colossal loss with coalitional resistance.